Anyway, Taoiseach, it's a factual question.
It is indeed.
10, 11. Well,
it's a totally factual answer. Nothing other than facts. Count Corl, I propose to take questions 10 and 11 together. I've chaired 5 Cabinet Committee meetings since June 2018. Cabinet Committee B, Social Policy and Public Services, met on the 7th of June and 22nd of October. Cabinet Committee C on the European Union met on the 21st of June. Cabinet Committee A on Economy on the 9th of July. And 12th of November, Cabinet Committee D is scheduled to meet this Thursday, the 15th of November.
Factual answers are important because certainly in the previous administration a lot of work was done through the Cabinet subcommittees and they usually met for a full day. I know it is your practice that I think more work is done at the full Cabinet rather than at Cabinet subcommittees, but often that means you have very, very long agendas. The specific question I want to ask you is in relation to the Infrastructure Committee, whether that deals with the National Broadband Plan. When we went through the hiatus of the resignation of the former Minister for Communications and the hiatus of what is one of the most important infrastructural projects that you've described yourself as analogous to rural electrification, that is the rollout of broadband to the country. What has happened on that? Have you actually had a Cabinet subcommittee discuss the National Broadband Plan? Where are we now in relation to the review of the integrity of the process to date? When will we actually have real proposals brought back here? Because there are literally tens of thousands of people living in my constituency and across the whole country desperately anxious to know when they will actually have access to broadband connections. And I think this is, if you like, one of the areas where you would imagine a bespoke Cabinet committee would bring in all the officials concerned, because obviously all the officials can't attend at a Cabinet meeting, from across government departments to ensure that there is a full and vigorous evaluation completed of the process to date. What needs to be done to mend the, in my judgment, fatally damaged hand of government in relation to the process to date, and how do we proceed from here?
Deputy McDonald, do you have a supplementary?
Very briefly, Les Concorla. Taoiseach, I'm not sure at which committee the idea floated by Minister Michael Darcy, in which he said the government would consider a referendum to override judicial discretion in the awarding of compensation claims if they don't reduce injury payouts over the next 2 years, if or where that featured. I just draw to your attention that the Cost of Insurance Working Group, which the same Minister chairs, published its 7th progress report yesterday, and that highlighted again the government's failure to set up an insurance fraud unit, which sums up, I believe, your overall failure to tackle the insurance rip-off. Yesterday we were told the Garda Commissioner has yet to form a view on the proposal and that there are a number of issues which will require further consideration before any decision to proceed is taken. So this is a very, very disjointed and messy set of messages coming from government, and I wonder if you could afford some clarity on the matter, Taoiseach.
Martin.
When the old system of Cabinet committees was changed and new committees with allegedly much broader mandates were established, we were told that this was to enable a more dynamic and active role for the committees, but the opposite seems to have happened. The reality is that with the many committees meeting very rarely, is what seems to have happened. I agree with Deputy Howlin in his analysis, and I don't think it's arguable that the committees are playing any substantive role in moving policy forward. If you look at 2 critical issues at the moment, health and broadband, there is no evidence that the relevant committees have made any impact. They've only met a couple of times this year. When challenged, Taoiseach, the last time on this, you said that you like to raise things at the full Cabinet meeting. That would mean very brief and limited papers being prepared and brief discussions, by definition, by the length of them, with no room for the kind of more detailed discussions that were the norm in terms of Cabinet subcommittees of the previous genre. In other words, you could be a full afternoon on a particular topic with all relevant officials available, yes, and relevant ministers. And that's how I think well-functioning cabinet committees worked. So, for example, the Infrastructure Committee, I think, met once at the start of the year. We'll meet once again, I think, once or twice this year. Now, are you happy that that represents adequate strategic oversight of an issue like broadband, for example? Giving the growing shambles and incoherence in relation to rural broadband, an issue which is now your personal crusade. Can you tell us how you and Cabinet have been carrying out your oversight role, given how rarely it's been discussed at Cabinet Committee level? And that's a very real issue, Taoiseach, in terms of what we're now learning in terms of the costs. It's been multiples of what was originally understood, and also the whole issue of what transpired over the last 5 to 6 weeks in terms of meetings and so on. One gets the distinct sense that the Cabinet's eye was off the ball in terms of rural broadband, and that there wasn't a Cabinet committee that was really across the issue or on top of it.
Deputy Boyd Barrett.
The failure of your government to deliver social housing, council housing for people on the housing list or people in homeless hubs is well known. But I want to ask about what discussions you have had, which subcommittee deals with it, and to what extent you've got a handle on the issue of affordability for people whose incomes are above the eligibility criteria but too little to get a bank loan. Because yesterday, just as an example, I had a distraught mother talking about her son and her daughter-in-law, who is highly qualified, working for a telecoms company, cycles all the way from Ballybrack to Dundrum every single day, works, gets a reasonable wage. His wife works as a hairdresser, and they applied for the Rebuilding Ireland home loan scheme and were refused. No explanation. They have their deposit, they have a clean credit rating, refused. And the mother just said, "Is this scheme a scam?" That's what she said to me. Is it a scam? If someone like my son, making the efforts he's made to get himself educated and working, and his wife, can't get this scheme, who gets this scheme? How could they possibly be turned down from it? And she went on to say that in her research, I don't know if you can confirm this, that 67% of applications for the Rebuilding Ireland home loan scheme are being refused. 67%. I mean, that's just a shocker. Taoiseach, what are you doing? What sort of scheme is that to help people who can't get on the housing list but have absolutely no chance of being able to afford in the open market? That's just extraordinary. I mean, have you got a handle on this? Do you understand that? What have you got to say to that distraught mother and her son?
Taoiseach. Oh, Deputy Burton. My apologies.
Just commenting on the last one, Taoiseach, I produced a similar case to you there not so long ago of a tradesman married to a hairdresser with her own business. Their only child is 10 years old, so therefore their childcare costs are not as high. They meet all the criteria, and yet they've been turned down. What I wanted to ask you was, some time ago when I asked you about the Cabinet Committee on Security issues and related issues, including the Gardaí meeting, and about the report on the future of policing, you told me that as Taoiseach, which is fair enough, that you have a different style. You don't like having cabinet subcommittees, that you prefer that it is discussed, reports like that are discussed by the whole cabinet. That's fine, that's always happened. But I asked you then in a follow-up what happened, and you said the report was noted. And since that time, I have not seen any evidence that the report has been acted on. Now, again, from my own experience, with such a detailed report as the future of policing, I can't see how much progress in the detailed carrying out of the list of actions in that report it can be discussed other than at some kind of format of subcommittee where detailed actions are commissioned by you as Taoiseach for the implementation of this really vital report, because again in our own constituency, people are really complaining that we just don't see enough, for example, of community guard policing, which is at the heart of the proposals in the future of policing.
Thank you, Deputy Taoiseach.
Last 5 minutes or to your breaking that the text has been agreed between the UK negotiators and the EU negotiators, and that was agreed last night at 9 p.m. So you're probably aware of that. But I just apropos the response to Deputy Burton's earlier question, but if you could comment on that.
Well, look, as there's often things in the media now that are reported, but I have obviously been here for the last I don't know how many hours, 2 or 3 hours, so I haven't spoken to my officials or been able to speak to any of my officials in the last 2 hours or so. I think in terms of working mechanisms, it's I think always sensible to be flexible and to be practical in how you decide to operate government business. As members have acknowledged, unlike in previous governments, I've put a big focus in having all of the Cabinet involved in decision making as far as is practicable. So today, for example, we spent an hour on Brexit, and while Cabinet committees do include officials and advisors, they often exclude ministers. So I'd like to do more things with ministers than would have been done in the past. Very often do bilateral or trilateral meetings, particularly around health and housing, involving me, the line minister, and then another relevant minister, usually the Minister for Finance. And yes, we use the Cabinet committees too. So, for example, what we decided on the O'Toole report, on the report on the future of policing, we specifically decided that the Cabinet would note it, would agree to its publication, but the Minister Flanagan would come back to the Cabinet subcommittee with a reasoned response to it and an implementation plan. And on that occasion, the right approach, in my view, was that it should be noted by Cabinet, published, and then referred to the Cabinet subcommittee for further consideration. The Infrastructure Committee, which is D, yes, does cover the National Broadband Plan, and I get a report every 2 weeks on the progress being made on the National Broadband Plan. On Thursday, we'll have a meeting of that Cabinet subcommittee, and it'll deal with 2 major items, one being housing, the other being the implementation of Project Ireland 2040, and that will include, of course, broadband. When it comes to National Broadband Plan, essentially there are 2 steps now to come. The first is the report by Peter Smith on the process, as well. The process has been okay, and if it's imminent, I don't know the exact date, but it's imminent. And the second thing after that, obviously, would be to make a decision on the bid. We'd have to take into account the cost, the timelines, the practicality, and whether or not to go ahead with it. I haven't seen it. It's imminent. Hasn't arrived yet. On a referendum on compensation, there's no proposals to have a referendum on compensation payments at present. But I would like to acknowledge the fact that the work done by Minister Darcy and Minister Murphy before him has shown results. Motor insurance, for example, peaked back in 2016, went up very, very steeply. It's fallen by 20% since then, and a lot of that is down to the work led by Minister Murphy and more recently Minister Darcy. And also health insurance, which had been increasing very rapidly under previous governments, has levelled off and in fact even fallen in the last year or two. And a lot of that is down to the legislation that we brought in around lifetime community rating. That has worked, and that's legislation that I brought through this House, which has made a difference in terms of health insurance, which had been going up and up and up every year for I don't know how long, now levelling off and actually falling when it comes to VHI. On affordability and the Rebuilding Ireland Home Loan, I'm advised that about 1,000 loans have already been approved, which is 1,000, which is a not insubstantial number. The way the rules work, obviously, is that you have to have been refused by a bank or a credit institution. You also do have to be able to afford it, to pay it back. That's the prerequisite of any particular loan. But there have been a lot of complaints about it. I have at least 6 from my constituency, and it is a new product. 1,000 people have qualified for it already. But yes, maybe it can be improved, and that's something that the department is working on.
Thank you, Taoiseach.